Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's report shows that the number of families entering the shelter system grew 33% from fiscal year 2012 to fiscal year 2015. And about 10,000 families living in shelter in December of 2015 were not new to the shelter system. They had entered for the first time in a previous year. Over 4,500 of those families, in fact, first entered shelter more than 10 years ago. And we at ICPH continue to strive to provide actionable data with an eye toward informing policy decisions. The conversation around homelessness is a conversation about poverty and how we help all families in New York City find economic, educational, health, and housing stability.
We have some 12,000 families, 23,000 children. We call this a crisis, but when is a crisis not a crisis? We've been doing this now for over 30 years, almost 40 years, 4 decades of homelessness in New York City, and family homelessness in particular. On a map serves one purpose, to really start to put this down where people can look at it and see what's happening. But the question should really be why? Why are we here? Why do we see the same thing? Why is it 40 years later? So I just want to put an environmental context on this, on what's been going wrong and why we continue to do this for all of this time. If you look at homeless policy in the city of New York, it's all been based around housing. That's always been the case. Homelessness is housing. That's what we think and that's what we talk about. And that's one aspect of it. But city policies have always been based on 3 simple principles. Number 1 is affordable housing. Affordable housing, yes, we need it. But then the question becomes affordable for who and will it be enough? And the answer is always no. The second is prevention. Who wouldn't want to prevent a family from becoming homeless? So every year we spend millions of dollars, and the city does every year, and then we take a static number, and we say, well, this year we kept 10,000 families from becoming homeless, coming into the shelter system. So prevention is good, but then the question becomes, what does prevention really do long term? Well, you prevent today, you will not prevent for everyone tomorrow. Many of these families will return. They come here for a particular reason in crisis, and they will return again and again, and eventually some portion of prevention becomes part of the homeless population. So you have the housing deficit, growing this. You have prevention, where it fails, growing this. And third, most importantly, are these voucher systems. And the idea of presenting vouchers as an opportunity to short-circuit what's going on with homelessness, and that's all it becomes. It's a short-circuit process. It is not a long-term solution. You provide vouchers, and so the idea is always, from government's point of view, as a policy thing, we can empty the system to a certain degree, we can keep moving families out, and we've solved the problem, and let the next administration take it. Vouchers have 2 purposes. Number 1, the problem is they are a support to move out, but they are not a long-term support. They're usually time-centered, they end at a certain particular time, and then you really come to what homelessness is about. Homelessness is about the ability to maintain your home, not necessarily to get your home. Can you maintain it if you get it, and if government provides it for you? And we know today that somewhere 22% of the people that come into the system, the family system every year, are new to the system. The other 78% have been here before, one time, one place or another. So vouchers are, yes, a window. Are they a permanent exit? The answer is no. The second problem with vouchers are any time you come up with a public policy issue in government that gives something away, that becomes a flag, that look, we have something here today, and in this case, they're about $1,500 vouchers. Come and get it, or it's gone. And people see this as the time to come into the system, even if they're not homeless, and they're in a terrible housing situation, or they're living doubled up or tripled up, and they will enter the system to get their piece of the pie, and you overwhelm the system. And that's what has happened through every administration for the past 30 to 40 years in this city. We are a housing-based solution, which this is not. Know your population. If you look at the homeless population, half of the young mothers or fathers in the system haven't completed high school. Only 20%, I don't care what anybody says, I hear people say 80% of our population in our facility has work history. Not true. 20% have real work experience that will lead to work, real employability. Those are usually working poor families that for some reason, some crisis, got stuck up in the system and entered it, and they can move out. 80%, half of them don't have an education, and the other whole group of them don't have any experience that you can manage. You have domestic violence that drives so many families into the shelter and breaks families up in the system, driving foster care. And then you have other chronic problems that pop up from time to time. The mayor now is approaching this the way all mayors have approached this. Make space in the system. We're overwhelmed, we have to come out of hotels. Kids are killed today as kids were 30 years ago. Get out of the hotels. We're going to open 90 shelters. We're going to open 90 shelters through a fair share process where, well, if this percentage comes from your borough, you're getting that percentage of shelters, and we're going to put them not in poor communities because we don't want to concentrate poverty. We are going to put them all around. Well, that's a failed policy from the start. The real answer is not to open a shelter anymore. Now, doesn't it make more sense to build a community center, a residential community center that you can call a residential community residential resource center, that you can put your health clinic there, that you can put your after-school programming, your daycare, but it is job-centered, it is education-centered for the parents and the kids, and it's open to the community. And you put it in the communities where the families come from. And you put it on housing authority property that the city is now leasing away to for-profit developers. It makes more sense, it can be done overnight on city property, and that's what you should build. Not 90 shelters, but 90 community residence resource centers where the families are back in the community they came from, where they know the people who live in the community, where their families live, where they know the drugstore, where they know the grocer, where they know the police officers. That's how you can reduce homelessness. I've been in this business a long time, all right? On the government side, nonprofit side, and from an academic point of view, you can see the stupidity in the incremental policies that go nowhere. That's why we're in a circle. Somebody has to bite the bullet and say we've done it wrong, we need to do it right, and we need to do it a different way, and who wouldn't buy into that? The community would welcome these resources. They're missing in poor communities. You'd stabilize your community. Instead, we take a mother from Queens with her kids and we put them in Staten Island, say, now you go to school here and you go to work there. It doesn't work.
Today's panel are all luminaries in their fields. To introduce them and moderate is Mirella Ivarak of WNYC. Ms. Ivarak is a reporter covering poverty and homelessness. Her work has been honored with numerous awards, including a Gracie Award for Outstanding Reporter Correspondent. Mirella holds master's degrees in journalism from Columbia University and in international affairs from the University of Cambridge. Please welcome her.
Jennifer, I wanted to start with you. In this report that you published today, you found that in 2015, only 19% of the families entered the system for the first time in that calendar year. So the majority of the families that entered the shelter system earlier at some point. Can you talk a little bit about what you found and why so many families repeatedly returned to the shelter system?
Basically, there were only 19% of families who entered in the same calendar year. So if you look at families who entered the system or who are living in the shelter system in December of 2015, only 19% of those families entered at some point during 2015. So what we really see is that families are entering the system and then they are experiencing homelessness multiple times. And this kind of instability is incredibly damaging for children, for families, employment. One thing that definitely contributes to this in the data, while we see, if you look at the shelter numbers today, there are about 2,500 families who are in shelter. But that really is just a small sliver of the pie in terms of who is experiencing homelessness. We have over 100,000 students in New York City in 2015-16 have been identified as homeless. And so there's a much larger scope of instability. So when we're thinking about what is going on with families, in communities, we need to be thinking about this larger scope of instability and how do we create long-term stability for families?
And how does the fact that so many families exit the shelter system without a rental subsidy tie into this?
Sure. So if you look at the return to shelter rate within a year for families, about 10% of families who exit the shelter system return within 1 year. But then if you look at that between those who received a rental subsidy and those who did not receive a rental subsidy, it's 1 in 5 families who did not receive any sort of rental subsidy returned to the system within 1 year versus about 2% of families who did receive a rental subsidy. Now, on the surface, you could say, okay, we should all be providing rental subsidies to all families who are exiting shelter. But what we need to consider then is what Ralph was talking about, which these are all short-term, or the majority of these are short-term rental subsidies. So we need to think about what happens after those rental subsidies end. And again, how do we create this kind of long-term stability for families?
When we think what brings people into the shelter system, I'm sure eviction comes to many people's minds, but Kelly, you run 8 domestic violence shelters, and it's actually the leading driver of homelessness. Can you talk a little bit about the specific challenges domestic violence survivors face as they leave abusive relationships and enter the system?
Sure. So it's not surprising to find that domestic violence is a leading cause when anywhere from 1 out of every 3 to 1 out of every 5 adults experience DV at some point in their lifetime. And for our survivors, many of them today are doing what you and I are doing. They're at work, they're going to school, they're picking up their kids, and they don't yet know that the thing is going to happen later on today that's suddenly going to disrupt their life. Right? They're going to go home tonight, something's going to happen, and suddenly them and their children are going to have to live in a brand new borough. And so it can be a real traumatic experience for the family, not only what they've been experiencing, but then to suddenly, without a lot of planning, have to uproot everything about themselves. And so we have a lot of our DV shelters are really working with families who didn't know that they were going to be sleeping in our shelter when they woke up this morning. And takes a really long time to get simple things like their children's school books, their clothes, figuring out what they're going to do about work. I know for me I would lose access to my childcare, which would be a very large problem for me. And is for many of our families. So they're really sort of taking all of the things that typical homeless families are experiencing and then adding this violence and trauma piece to it as well.
And you run, so there are essentially two types of domestic violence shelters. Some are run by the Department of Homeless Services, others are funded by the Human Resources Administration. Can you talk a little bit about the differences in that system?
Sure. So in New York City, we have the Department of Home, DHS, and HRA-run DV shelters. Both systems provide services to DV survivors. Obviously, most people's preference is to provide services for DV survivors in the HRA DV system, but because of capacity issues, that's not always able to happen. So when survivors are identified, so there's a NOVA, which is No Violence Again, that's run by HRA that is now located both in the Single Women's Assessment Center and in the PATH, which is a huge improvement that the administration really paid attention to advocates saying we needed to have services available in both systems. And they work to identify families to either try to help prioritize getting them into the DV shelter system and or to get them connected with community-based resources if there's a capacity issue. In the DV HRA system, there are both emergency shelters and Tier 2 shelters that folks have access to, though the Tier 2 shelters at this point only can serve about 10% of the domestic violence or emergency shelter. So there's currently an idea about adding some additional capacity to that, because I think for myself, with all the advantages that I have, DV survivors have about 180 days in the DV system before their time expires, and with lack of access to my job, to my child's school, I'm not sure in this city, in this market, that I could recreate myself in that amount of time.
And Jennifer, you found that there are geographical differences in terms of why people enter the system. So can you talk a little bit about in which communities domestic violence is the most common reason?
Sure. So, as you said, there are very stark differences between different communities. In general, domestic violence and eviction tend to be the top reasons for shelter entry, but this does vary by community. For example, if you're looking at South Bronx, what you see in community district in the Mott Haven area, the leading cause there is domestic violence. Now, if you look over in East New York, you'll see that the leading cause is eviction. Now, in both communities, both domestic violence, eviction, overcrowding, immediate return, they all play a factor, but exactly how those all intersect is going to be different in different communities. So this makes it very important when we're thinking about what solutions are needed in terms of addressing homelessness, that we think about the dynamics that are taking place locally in each community. Otherwise, we're not necessarily going to be meeting the needs of that community and really thinking about what is driving families into shelter.
Diana, you work with Latino families, and what we also see in this report is that in some areas, many people are entering the system because of overcrowding, like from East Harlem. Do you find in working with Latino families that there is a reluctance to enter the shelter system and maybe perhaps stay longer living in a double or tripled up situation?
Well, I think it depends on the status of the family. In this current political climate, if you're undocumented, we are finding that our families have a tremendous amount of fear, and fear is very real. So I don't want to underestimate the power of fear. So our families, even in conversations with us, are saying, do not document this conversation. We don't want you to document this conversation. And it's something that we've been trying to communicate up to elected officials, saying that although you want to keep track of what's going on, it's going to be hard for us to do that because our families are unwilling to step out of their homes. So even in the context of the policy that just came out with the mayor supporting schools and saying ICE will not invade your schools, that's great, but families are more concerned about what happens outside of the four walls of schools. So they're preparing for separation with their children. They're having these conversations in their churches with their other family members. Who can take care of my children in the case that I get separated? So again, fear can create a hostile climate. And the other piece of this that I think that we don't often talk about, undocumented families don't always have access to some of the permanent housing programs because they're federally funded. So, you know, I always want to take the opportunity to advocate for the DREAM Act regardless of the current political climate, because it can lose its power and value if we don't consistently bring up that is needed so that our undocumented families can get access to the same resources that other families have access to.
Are there certain things you'd like to see the local, state government do in terms of informing people about their rights regardless of their status?
So they're doing Know Your Rights workshops across schools, and community schools also is being proactive. They have a webinar coming up for schools to talk about figuring out how do you support families in transient housing situations. But I think what would be really key is making sure that you're involving and communicating to all of the key stakeholders that these families go to for support. So we know that our parent coordinator at one of our schools is relatively new. They don't have a strong rapport with the parents in the way that our community school person does. We've been in that school for over 10 years, so parents are more likely to come and talk to us than they are to the parent coordinator. So how do schools and all of these systems make sure that the community-based organizations supporting parents and families also have access to the same knowledge and information, because we oftentimes become the point which a family will go to seek support and help. So that would be a wonderful kind of piece. How do we make sure that the resources are being distributed out across all of the key players in the game so that we're all kind of approaching the support that's required for families from the same space and access to information and knowledge.
In this report, one other thing that came out was that more than a quarter of the shelter census increase between 2012 and 2015 can be traced to 6 community districts, including 2 in the South Bronx. I've been working on a project there for 2.5 years. Can you talk a little bit about what you have found during those 2.5 years about the challenges that the communities face in this area, which has such a high rate of poverty and unemployment?
Sure. So I co-lead an initiative called South Bronx Rising Together, which is a collective impact initiative in Community Board 3 in the heart of the South Bronx. We've been at it for closer to 3 years at this point. And the idea is to build a pathway of success for kids from birth all the way through college and career. We have very lofty goals, like making sure all kids are healthy, all kids are ready for kindergarten, succeeding in school, all the way through getting post-secondary success and beginning a career. And what I think makes our work a little bit different than programming that continues to happen in that community is we're trying to add value to those programs. We think there's a need for connective tissue to sort of bring those providers together to really understand what's going on here. Do we really know the population that we're trying to work with? I think there is general recognition that kids have multiple needs, and sometimes they're going to one place to get one thing met, but some of the root causes of what's going on really aren't always understood or addressed. So there's a real interest in figuring out how to get lots of partners to work together to understand what those are and to more efficiently, more effectively more sustainably address those needs. One of our goals is all kids succeed in school, and we're looking at an indicator of third grade reading, which is at this point, a pretty well-established indicator of how well kids are in terms of what happened before third grade, and also what predictive of what happens after third grade. So we don't just care about the reading score, but really it's an indicator of what else is going on for kids, although we do care about the reading score. We were smacked in the face when we were looking at the data about what's happening with third graders in our schools, that only 1 out of 5 are on grade level in third grade, which we've known that for a long time. There's been a need there. Initially, our thought was we needed to work on curriculum and sort of think about how to build literacy-rich environments in home and school. But then we realized that 40% of our kids in K through 12, in all 61 schools in CD3, 40% of the kids were chronically absent last year. So it doesn't really matter how good the curriculum is if kids are missing them at school. And so when we think about, well, what's the root cause of all this absence, you probably know the story pretty well. It's things like asthma, it's things like issues of safety, but also a real driver is homelessness. And we wish we had more data to really pinpoint exactly in real time when kids are moving in and out of these situations. But anecdotally, as we talk to principals, they're all saying, we don't know what to do about this. We work in the school. We need help. So part of our work has been figuring out ways to support, to add value and capacity to schools. Platforms for understanding what's happening with their data every week. How are kids doing? What are we seeing in terms of trends and patterns? And how do we match the appropriate resources to those needs as we identify them? And so there's lots of work to be done, but I think we're finding that there are schools that, after employing some of these strategies, are seeing some real gains. One school in particular, PS 42 in the South Bronx, decreased their chronic absence rate by 20 points in a year and a half. So it is doable to make a difference.
Can you talk a little bit more about what exactly they did?
So it really was how creating a platform in their school, they've been rethinking what an attendance team is. So this is a community school. I should probably say that community schools primarily have been, I think, are well positioned to really respond to these needs. Because I think, as my colleague here said, there is someone in that building who wakes up every day thinking about how do we really know what our kids' needs are, and do we have the right supports in place to meet those needs? Do we have them currently? And if we don't, let's go out and find them. So PS42 and other schools as well, but this particular school, they now have a weekly attendance team meeting that not only includes attendance teachers, but includes members of their community, includes a school nurse, includes, I believe they recently were able to bring in someone from the local shelter to really begin to understand better who our families are, what those needs are, and then to create some plans every week of how we're going to intervene. That sort of steady, sort of day in, week out work has made a huge difference. So they really understand what's happening. They're not waiting for months to go by before understanding that there's a problem here. And I think the chronic absence metric ends up being a really important leading indicator of where we might need to do some more work.
And doing this project, have you figured out that there are some challenges specific to homeless families that you would love to address if you could, if there was if there was enough funding, if you had more funding?
I'm going to dream a little bit. Well, I have to say, I think on some level, even though we don't have, let me just back up and say that a lot of our work is driven by data. That we want to measure across the entire region, how healthy are kids? How many kids have access to or are using, how many 3 and 4-year-olds, for example, are using, are in some sort of formal early childhood program? It's less than half, it turns out in CD3. How many kids are using the ER to treat asthma? I think it's double the rate of New York City in CD3. So even though we're not specifically targeting homeless students, we know that homelessness is a real driver for a lot of those numbers. And so what we'd love to have is some more infrastructure around a data sort of platform that would give us real-time information across the entire region, but also equip people like community school directors and other folks in the community with real-time information about the problem's happening now. What do we do now? Let's not wait until the year is through to sort of, rubberneck and sort of wish we'd done more. So I think having more information in the hands of people who have resources would be a tremendous step in the right direction.
And when we talk about the kind of services we want to provide in the shelter system, we talk about connecting people to jobs. DW recently wrote a big magazine piece where you profiled 7 homeless New Yorkers, most of whom work, like a third of people in the shelter system. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what you learned in that process of interviewing people and why so many working New Yorkers are also homeless?
Yeah, I felt like a lot of the reporting I was doing and conversations I was having were backing up into conversations about labor, about work. Without this sort of wraparound societal support that we all, I think everyone in this room might enjoy, the people that are in the shelter system aren't able to look for jobs beyond minimum wage offerings or much beyond. And even when you look at that pie in the sky in 3 years when we get to $15 an hour, you're still doing the math with New York City rents, it still doesn't add up. It still doesn't add up. I would echo a couple of things that were said here, and something that Ralph said about the 90 new shelters isn't the answer. And I do think there's a lot of truth in that. I think that what I saw when I was talking to people was a lack of meaningful relationships with the people in the system with whom they were interacting, caseworkers, housing specialists. And I gather that a lot of times this was because the caseworker, the housing specialist, was overwhelmed by the workload that they had. So I would like to see, and I think the people I like to talk to would like to see more human contact, more human availability. I worked for a while on a project in Detroit called Earn and Learn, and it was meant to put formerly incarcerated back to work. And it was a lot of stakeholders coming to the table, a lot of nonprofits coming together to work to get grant money to do a big program, and they had big fancy training centers where they were training people to work on wind turbines, state-of-the-art stuff going on. And they discovered one of the individuals who put that program together was talking to somebody who was going through the program, and it wasn't going so well for him, and she couldn't quite put her finger on it. And she had to go through about an hour-long conversation with him to discover that he needed reading glasses. He couldn't see the machinery and the buttons. And she went and got him an eye exam and got him glasses, and everything was fine. I think that for me, that crystallizes the need for individualized experience. Fewer new buildings, more people engaging the DHS clients, the people in this shelter system, to find out what their individualized, idiosyncratic, personal circumstance needs are. That those human resources, I think, are what the people I was talking to were missing.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think one of the great things your article did, and we spoke a little bit about this before, is it humanized the narrative for individuals, and so often we forget that homeless people are human beings. And so we need to dignify them and the experience that they're having and extend some compassion. The trauma someone steps into that system with is sometimes unbearable, and you just want someone to acknowledge that trauma. You want someone to see you as a full human being in person. And so I think, again, how do you engage other stakeholders who do that really well to help show other folks how to do that?
I'm sure in your reporting, DW, you saw that there were people who were working and had subsidies and still were finding it hard to leave the shelter system. For those who don't directly interact with those people, can you tell us a little bit more about why that happens?
In terms of sort of returning to the system, or just
Not being able to leave the shelter system
Yeah.
despite having a job and a subsidy.
Yeah, so part of it is wages. The jobs they get don't do what they need to do in terms of making rents meet. But even with the subsidies, the thing I heard over and over again was landlords not accepting them. So this happens all the time. And I talked to the city about this. I talked to Stephen Binks about this. And obviously they go to if a big landlord or a big developer does that, it's easier to track them down. But someone who owns 1 or 2 buildings in central Brooklyn and says, no, I'm not going to take you, it's hard to get that person legally. This is a very it's a hard thing for the state and city to track down in terms of nefarious landlords, but that's a huge issue. They can't get the vouchers accepted. So that's one thing that I would say stood out as sort of something that inhibited a lot of people from getting out of the system with any longevity. Also, the episodic nature of work, not just wages. I mean, I talked to a construction worker who's making over $60 an hour right now. She's in a shelter, but that job is ending actually just about now, this week or next. And then she's union, she'll be making nothing. So she goes to a landlord with $60 an hour and says, hey, look what I'm doing. And he says, let me see your wages for the last 6 months, and she can't do that, so he won't give her anything. And then the shelter tells her she has to leave because she's making $60 an hour. So the nature of labor in the 21st century, episodic work, we've yet to figure that out, how to deal with that, but that's a major issue.
And you sort of started talking about this, about the mayor's new plan to build 90 new shelters over the next 5 years across the city. I'd love to hear from all of you about what you think, if that will help the city get a handle on the homelessness crisis. Kelly?
Yeah, so I'd say that one thing that's really important to us is we know that shelters save lives in terms of domestic violence. That we've had not only in the city but in other places where people haven't been able to get into a safe, confidential shelter, and that's been fatal for themselves and for their kids. And so I think that there's definitely a gap between the DV shelters that exist and the demand that's out there. So from the domestic violence perspective, it's really important to us. I also think a lot of times that until we answer why violence still exists, domestic violence is going to continue to remain the leading driver of homelessness. That oftentimes when we hear this, people say, well, why did the person go back? And until the question becomes why does abuse happen, we have to end the systemic causes of domestic violence. And many times the policies that happen are really focused on the victim doing something X, Y, or Z, and they don't control the actions of the other person. And so I think that's a really important distinction to make, that we could do, the survivor could do everything right. We just had the terrible incident that happened in San Bernardino. By everyone's standards, she did everything right. She left, she talked to her family, she was getting support, and still died. And so I think it's really important that any solution to this, to end DV being a leading driver of homelessness, has to address why abuse continues to happen.
And I guess just building off that, I'd like to point out that in the data that we have in our report that's indicating that domestic violence is the leading driver of shelter entry, we're not even counting the HRA numbers. We're just talking about DHS shelters, because that's the data that we have. So the impact and the scope of domestic violence as a driver of shelter entry and of family homelessness is even larger than what the numbers that we have are showing. So I think that that's critical to talk about. In terms of your question, Marilla, I think that we need to be sort of looking at this in the short and long term. Are 90 new shelters going to end the homelessness crisis in New York? Back to what Ralph was saying, until we address these underlying issues, it's not going to change the dynamic that we're seeing. We're not going to see fewer families, this number decreasing. Almost every year we have about 1,000 to 2,000 additional new families entering the system. About 10,000 families have been in the system before and are just recycling or returning, coming back in, experience this chronic instability, which is incredibly disruptive to children and families, and the ability to maintain any kind of stable and long-term employment. Those families are not going to necessarily be helped by the 90 new shelters. Now, if the shelters were created differently, if we think about what kind of resources we can add to those shelters, if we re-envision what we mean by a shelter, maybe that's a different story. There are other factors that might be helped, like if families are moved out of hotels, that is a good thing. We know the hotel situation is really bad. We also know that families are having to commute for their children to school incredible distances. Only about 50% of families are placed in shelter that is nearest to the location of their youngest child's school. And the chronic absenteeism rates for children who are in shelter right now are over 50%. That is unacceptable. That is, no child will be able to succeed with that kind of barrier in place. If they're not able to get to school, if they're not able to have the stability of their school and that community at home. So I think there are different levels that we need to be thinking about this on.
So I think I also want to pick up on Ralph's idea of re-envisioning what a shelter is. And first, full disclosure, before doing this work, I was part of our National Center for Community Schools, so I'm very much in the tank for community schools. And I think, given what we're seeing and how those schools are positioned to identify, both really understand in multifaceted ways, what children and families are experiencing, but also in very adaptive ways, identifying supports for those kids and solutions for those kids. There is something to be learned about that strategy that we can apply in different contexts as well. Schools are a really important place to do that, but they may not be the only place to do it. So we've thought a lot about a notion of creating, in CD3, creating impact hubs, which is really just an abstraction of what a community school is, but doing it in different contexts. So a library could have the equivalent of a community school coordinator in that building, really getting to know community members, matching needs and resources. We've thought about public housing being a place where we can have that kind of capacity. And I think a shelter is not really, it wouldn't be crazy to have that kind of capacity put there as well. So I do wonder if there are lessons that can be learned from what has been, I think, a really bold statement from this administration about supporting community schools. Let's take the same kind of idea and do it in other places as well.
And I would say that I think it's important to point out that the city aims to close over 200 facilities while adding those 90. So they are trying to economize. But the larger point is that new facilities further institutionalize what was meant to be a temporary solution. And it's better to think of things, solutions in terms of campaigns. I think when we think about a system, the psychological effect there, the thing we're searching for, I think, as humans is, okay, we have something in place that can be fixed, okay, good. We don't have to think about it. I mean, I'm talking society at large. It can't be thought of as a system, we put it in place, it's doing the trick. It has to be one campaign after another to address the very real issues that are popping up from year to year and generation to generation, and that's what stands out to me.
We have a community school as well, and I guess one thing that comes up for me is that it also is on a 3-year grant. So we have to reapply, and then we might not potentially get that money again. So recognizing that when you're continuously putting a Band-Aid on a problem, you're not going to find a long-term solution. You're not on the road or the pathway to that. All you're doing is being reactionary, and you're trying to minimize the problem in the interim. So one thing I would advocate for is, it goes back to funding. Funding the intersectionality also, so not just making it a single issue, so recognizing that homelessness is connected to jobs, is connected to schooling, it is connected to community resources. Until you put more money into backing and supporting every single element that impacts poverty, then you're never going to get to a long-term solution. And so I think we have to rethink how we function and deal with the problems of homelessness. And the other piece is, if you're really serious about it, how are folks cross-collaborating from the CBO sector to the city government sector, and how is that message working from the top down? Because realistically, you can have work groups on the bottom, and we're part of coalitions from the community-based side, and we're also part of work groups from the city-based side. But if the key players are not in the room kind of making this a top priority for their particular agencies, then the problem still remains the same. It goes nowhere, and it still stays in a Band-Aid state. So I would be remiss to say, if we don't kind of take a holistic approach to the problem, we're not gonna get to a real solution. So are 90 shelters good? If we revision them, absolutely, I will agree with that. But simultaneously, we have to start thinking long-term and not short-term.
Yeah, can I say? I guess one other thing that I would add to what everyone is saying is also what tends to happen is people will see the data and then start developing outcomes but without understanding what was behind the data. So chronic absenteeism is a good example. So the commuting issue is real, right? And I've got to be honest, if I had a 3-hour commute one day and it's 20 degrees outside, I don't know what decisions I'm gonna make about getting up, right? But we also see things like the number of appointments that homeless families have to attend in order to maintain their benefits or employment or eligibility for this service is a huge reason families in our shelter miss school, simply because the school stops at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And if you have a noon appointment in the Bronx and have to get back to pick up your child who's in school in Staten Island, it's not possible. So we see lots of times our families are making decisions around do I maintain my public assistance? Do I maintain my public health appointment? Do I maintain my eligibility for this program? or does my child go to school for the day? And so I think you have to really understand all what's driving data and put policies in place that help support the variety of reasons why kids are missing school or whatever the particular policy might be.
And I'd just like to add in to that, building off what you're saying, that we looked at shelter entry, and on average, if you look at families who are in the shelter system, over 50% of them had to apply more than once. All of your children have to go to PATH, which is in the Bronx. You're going to miss a lot of school at that point. And then you go through your 10-day placement or temporary placement, and after that, you're going to have to reapply. Now, technically, some rules have changed, so, maybe you don't have to bring all your kids, but what we hear, on the ground is that how that's being implemented, people don't necessarily know all the rules. If your school is closing at 2:30, you're probably gonna have to bring your children anyways, because you don't know when your appointment is going to be finished. So we really need to address these real systemic issues that are furthering the instability that families are experiencing. And that is a part of, if we're talking about building 90 new shelters, what are those shelters going to look like? What is the entry process going to look like? How do we streamline the system so that it is actually supporting homeless families to end their homelessness long term, to make it so that their children can succeed in school? Because we know that outcomes, educational outcomes for homeless students are much, much worse than they are for students who are housed. But we also know that that is not because homeless students are less talented or have less potential than other students. So we need to think about how is the system that we have in place, how is that underlying these trends, what needs to be changed?
Can I actually?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think affordable housing is another major issue. So once you come out of a shelter, do you have access to affordable housing? And so I think while New York City is making a commitment to increase the number of affordable housing units, I don't want to, he said it earlier, who really can benefit from access to that affordable housing unit, and how many individuals in comparison need it to those that are actually available? We have to do more around affordable housing. There's no way around it.
That's one of the toughest challenges the city faces for sure. But going back to what you said about some of the bureaucratic challenges, that seems like something that would be easier to address. What would you like to see the city do?
I think that for DV survivors, that one thing that is making a difference for us right now is the state actually regulates a lot about the domestic violence shelter system. And so the state actually sets what the length of stay is for DV survivors. So it's not based on how much time the family needs, it's based on how much time Albany set. And I think that is a real challenge for families, that 180 days, again, if I come into a school system, let's say I come into shelter in September, my length of stay could be up in April, which means I'm now gonna have to go to a second or third school in 1 year. And that just doesn't make sense for all of our families. It can be really destabilizing. I think also just sort of a recognition that for DV and DHS providers, we're seeing families with a wide variety of issues when they come into shelter, and our families are sort of facing, do I figure out what to do in the short term to get myself temporarily stable, or do I focus on the long term? And to give you an example of that, we've had some families who are getting into what I consider to be really good job training programs, not just, let's talk about but training programs that sort of talk about the trauma associated with violence, that sort of incorporates getting to work on time and some of the basic things that our families need to know. And then they also are looking at this time clock ticking down until they need to be out of shelter, and they know they could go get a job down the street in a retail place that would temporarily help them. And so they're making choices about their time. And so I think oftentimes if our policies don't match, that our families are thinking about where they're gonna be sleeping in a few months versus what might help them have long-term stability. And we have to find a way to match that. Oftentimes our families, I think about myself, the things that have made me successful in my career, I've been able to work long hours, I've been able to make my boss's life easier, I've been able to go to continuing education, I've been able to say yes to lots of things. And our families aren't able to do lots of those things because of curfews, because of commuting issues, because of short-term appointments and so on. And until we find ways to sort of bridge those gaps to where families can meet their real short-term needs and plan for their real long-time future, we're going to continue to be in this cycle.
I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience, but just one final question for our panelists before that. Starting with Diana. So we've talked about all of these various challenges, about the new strategy a little bit. From your perspective, what would you say the city and the state would need to put in place to deal more efficiently with the problem of homelessness, and particularly family homelessness that we face?
Yeah, my pie in the sky dreaming. Pragmatically, I think as an initial solution, I want to underscore what Kelly is saying, that it is important that the policy match pragmatically what's going on the ground, and that folks take into consideration who are making the policies, how do you involve the stakeholders who are on the ground, who are better able to tell you what's actually happening in real time, so that you can make policies that are more realistic. And I find oftentimes when I'm in coalition spaces and with policymakers, they're not on the ground. They're not on the ground. And they're relying very much on us to communicate that up. So, but if we're not invited to the space, then guess what happens? They just never know. So that's one very pragmatic, realistic thing that I think could happen if the left were communicating with the right. We would be able to see programs. How can parents, and also how can you bring some of the job readiness work to the shelters and do some more integration of services in that way so that parents don't have to leave shelter. But we also know they have young children. So maybe it is about providing early child care services and support simultaneously while offering up job readiness training at the shelter so a parent does not have to leave. So again, it's about, if you're going to go this way, how do you make the approach more accessible?
I would say, in addition to finding ways to create more human beings to help people through their individualized issues in their lives, I'll say maybe two specific things that stand out to me that could be very helpful, and they're more about the short-term solutions. I think the individual human contact is about the long-term solutions. But short-term, one is AMI, individual median income, in terms of affordable housing. This is a joke. The word affordable is a joke. Average AMI in New York City is what, $71,000, $72,000, because we've got Westchester County. Do zip codes, do community boards. The city can do this and communicate it to the federal government. They've done it before, they're capable of doing it. So East New York, if you talk to someone about $66,000 affordability, it doesn't mean anything to them. So make it $28,000, make it $31,000. That's one thing. The other is, I think more effectively using the small turnover rate in public housing. I think it's 6%, 5%, it's about 4,500 units a year that become available in NYCHA housing stock. There's a very complicated automated system for picking people off that wait list of 270,000 people. Why not 1 year? Just prioritize, or just say they go to DHS clients. And there's a lot of overlap too with the other categories for that system, domestic violence survivors and so forth. Say that in 1 year, all of those 4,500 apartments go to DHS clients. That's, you could get 10, 15,000 people between families out of the system. That's one huge step. So those are two things that I think could be done very easy and quickly without a whole lot of capital that would be helpful for short-term solutions.
So I think I want to just pick up on Diana's point about making sure that we're really grounded in what's happening in the community. And so I'm not an expert on homelessness at all, so I don't really have an intelligent response to the question. So instead, I'm going to do a shameless plug. Recently, actually last year in January, the governor announced something called the Empire State Poverty Reduction Initiative, which is now getting off the ground. 16 communities, really mostly upstate, and the Bronx are part of this initiative. Children's Aid was selected to run that for the borough president, and we on May 5 and May 6 are going to have a two-day-long planning institutes. And really, what we want to do is invite the community in to say, here's the data about what's happening in the Bronx. Here's where it's happening. We are compiling a pretty considerable amount of information to really see those conversations, which would both be an invitation to have people interpret what's the story behind the numbers and sort of put a face to it and real understanding on what's happening on the ground. And then also to say, what do we do about this? Like, what are the recommendations that the community wants to put forward that we should think about really seriously, and how to leverage a $2.75 million investment. I joke about this, that we're supposed to eradicate poverty by May of 2018 with this money. I don't think it's going to happen then, although you should mark your calendars because it might. But I do think that we have really an unprecedented amount of money that can be spent in a way that the community wants us to spend it. And so I encourage everyone here, if you know the Bronx, if you love the Bronx, to make room on May 5 or May 6 to be a part of that conversation.
So I guess probably since my background is more in data, I'm going to take a different tact on here. I think the first thing that really we need to do is to be redefining what we mean by ending homelessness or reducing homelessness. And I think part of the problem there in terms of the indicators that we look at is we're all obsessed with this shelter census. So we look at what is the shelter census today, and how has that changed? Has it gone up? Has it gone down? Well, yes, that is an important indicator, but it's not telling us whether or not people are staying stably housed. It's not telling us whether or not they're coming back into the system. It's not telling us about the instability that that family is experiencing. It's not telling us about the instability that the children are experiencing. So we need to be thinking about things like return to shelter, but not just in a year. We need to be talking about 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. What is happening to that family over the course of their life? What's happening to the children in that family over the course of their growing up? And once we start looking at that and seeing what programs actually change those outcomes, that's when we're going to start really being able to dig in and change the dynamics that we're seeing. So I think we really need to be measuring what we find successful in a different way and looking at some of these other indicators.
And I guess I would just say two things. One, there's a lot of things that we could be doing additionally in shelters, but our rate doesn't match growing rent escalations and so on. And so providers are making choices between repair the roof or pay their staff, right? And so the rate has to match the actual cost of providing services if we want these additional things to be happening in shelter. You talked about the overwhelmed, like case manager instance that had like 40 families on their caseload. It's hard to be human with 40 folks that you have all of these demands on. And I think the other thing is that we can't lose sight of prevention for domestic violence, that again, until we address sort of the societal issues that allow violence against women and children to continue to happen, then we're still going to continue to see it. And we've seen a lot of the prevention dollars dry up over the last decade. And until we really get that emphasis back on actual primary prevention that impacts communities, we won't see that number change.
What I haven't really heard is anything with regard to funding or subsidizing. The city could be subsidizing vocational schools, sending some of our homeless parents to vocational schools to actually be certified in things like being a CPA or an accountant or a graphic designer or all the other things that, they can actually really make some money. I happen to belong to a nonprofit. It's a small group, but they have a 6-to-1 earning ratio. For every $6,000 they spend, if they send someone to, say, be a paralegal for $6,000, that person comes out and makes a minimum of $36,000 upon graduating. And so I'm thinking, how do we find the money instead of, something like spending $12 million on more city bikes? We could be using that same $12 million to be subsidizing vocational schools. There are hundreds of vocational schools in our city, and these people could be earning real certifications and getting real jobs. Would that be something that could be part of the solution?
So I think it's a really interesting idea. I'm not sure, even the term vocational school, I think right now there are many folks who sort of understand that to be less than optimal experience in terms of education, right? So I think there is an opportunity to re-envision what we mean by that, right? So there's been I think a really good push on CTE. Someone knows what that stands for.
Career and technical.
Thank you very much. We have experts in the room. Career and technical education, right? Which is, these are high schools that bring in, partners that have a particular expertise, and build in the work skills that those folks would need to, to get a job, really sometimes right out of college, right out of high school. They can also go on to get some post-secondary work as well. I think there's a real interest in doing more of that. I don't think we've really nailed that system. And I'm not sure how it would work to bring adults into that at this point. So I think it's really compelling, a really compelling idea, but I'm not sure that there's an answer quite yet on how to do that well.
I think something that's often missing that Ahmed pointed to is the high quality, and who is definitely kind of determining and assessing whether or not that's a high quality program for parents to be going to. I absolutely think adult education is necessary if we're going to talk about putting an end to poverty, which is one of the major root cause of homelessness. So a huge advocate of that, but in the how and who's monitoring that, that's where I would like to see some kind of someone building out, making sure that they're reputable school choices that parents are going to for adult education. And I would still advocate, how do you bring some of that work into the shelters? How do you subcontract folks who are doing it really well so that you're making sure that they're going into the space and again, making it accessible? How do we make the work accessible for parents who are in shelters and families? Because that's a part of the problem, is accessibility and access. And I will put a bit of a plug too for the work that we do. So we work, we have an early child care program where we work with providers and we can help you create an actually early child care provider. We often find that mothers who have young children end up being the ones who want to become providers. So we would love to go into a shelter and teach parents how to create an early child care provider center so they can start their own business and become entrepreneurs and really become the backbone of the workforce in many ways, we know for sure. We're working with anywhere from 7,000 to 16,000 toddlers and infants through the work that we're training providers up to do. So again, thinking about who's monitoring the quality and the access to vocational adult education programming.
I'll just add one thing quickly, because I think I'm reminded that I recently had a conversation with a person who does continuing ed at Bronx Community College, and he is struggling to find people to bring to that program. And there's like carpentry programs and, child care, there's all these opportunities, all that stuff. And so I think community colleges could be part of the solution for sure.
The city's spending huge amounts of money on eviction prevention, which is a good thing. Today we hear how domestic violence is now the #1 reason for people coming into shelter, yet we hear very little about the city increasing funding for domestic violence. I remember when it was 135 days, now I hear it's 180 days to get to stay in a DV shelter. What percentage of those families then go immediately into a DHS shelter? That's number one. Number two, should we have DV counselors in every shelter? And number three, do you think law enforcement is doing their part in helping to solve this problem?
The city has actually done, NYPD now has a partnership actually with Safe Horizon, where we're putting two victim advocates in every single NYPD precinct over the next 3 years, which is something, it's the most money that has been put into a project like that across the country. It's absolutely amazing because we can go in and do one-time, one-shot, sort of trainings for officers, but there's nothing like working with a victim advocate day in and day out. So we've just added our first class to the first 26 precincts. We're about to go into 26 additional precincts, and then later on this year we'll go into the final precincts. And I think that's going to be a really important partnership for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's going to help us identify survivors earlier, right? So if patrol is called out for a domestic violence incident, they were going to get a phone call from an advocate the next day saying, are there any other services? Let's talk to you about what other options that you might have. The state is the one that actually sets both our rate and our length of stay. And so we would love your support in advocating to the state to help get an additional rate. To the city's credit, New York City is the only place in the state where if you're an undocumented family that you can come and stay in a shelter without having to pay. Upstate, so the city covers that with tax rolls. So I will say that we're in a much better position here. Thanks to HRA and some of the work that they have really done around that. The rate should be coming out soon, so now would be a really good time to contact you, our political folks. So to answer your question about should there be social workers or so on in every shelter that are experts in domestic violence, absolutely, right? If we know that 25% of folks Safe Horizon and many other DV providers are actually partnering with a lot of DHS agencies to help train their staff on what we know. Because there's big differences in working with survivors. Safety is our #1 issue. And that might not always be on the forefront or on the mind of other people. So we have to think about things like, if I come into shelter and I lived in the Bronx, now I live in Staten Island and I need to get a protective order, we know to tell them, go back to the Bronx to get that protective order, because if you get it in Staten Island when your partner's served, it's gonna stay here in Staten Island, right? That might not be technical knowledge that every provider in the city is gonna have. We talked to them about the fact that if you use an ATM anywhere that's not your typical neighborhood, your partner's gonna know and be able to narrow down where you are. The other thing I'd like to say is we also recognize that it's only in the movies that survivors actually get to escape and hide from their partners. There's a lot of really great movies about that, but we actually have laws that require our people to stay in contact, especially if they're parenting, right? So if my abusive partner and I have a child in common, because of custody, we're gonna remain in contact because the law is gonna say that we have visitation for a really long time. And so it's really important that all providers sort of have that level of knowledge. So we both know how to work with the children and the adults who are sort of navigating the situation that in most of our minds, the person leaves, you know, we sort of pause and they're safe now. And we know in reality that's not what actually happens for our families.
Did you answer the question about how many families go to DHS shelters?
So I know for Safe Horizon, I don't know for the overall system. So the city, this year, of the people that left our shelter, we had about a third that moved into permanent housing. And then we had about 10% that left us that went into DHS, but that was actually, most of those families either exited the shelter because of safety concerns, meaning they might have been a sort of a risk to the rest of the community, or the commute sometimes was a big challenge, because a DV shelter, you can't stay in the community where you're from, and so for many of our families, just the commute factors became a problem, so they left to go back into the system to solve that problem.
What role do you think the labor movement can play in this? What I'm thinking about is what's happening in central Brooklyn right now with the Vital Brooklyn program, where the governor put $1.4 billion into central Brooklyn, and we're trying to, the communities come together to figure out what's the best way to invest this money inside of the community to make the community more sustainable. And I was looking at your chart here, I see that central Brooklyn is one of the most, where homelessness is happening the most, along with places like East Harlem. So I'm wondering, how can we partner with the work you're doing, because you seem to have solutions to some of the problems, and I just want to know if that discussion is taking place.
I mean, on some level, I think it's a response to the question earlier about how to sort of connect adults to some job training. I know that many labor unions are doing a lot of that, and so I think we can create a mechanism to do more of that. That'd be great. I'm not sure that we have solutions in place quite yet, so this is a perfect time to engage in conversation about how to really leverage the considerable, resources and talent and commitment that we see from labor unions. So I'd love to continue to talk about that.
And I would just add, I think this goes back to the conversation that we've been having about how do we re-envision what the shelter system is. If we can think about the shelter system, there is infrastructure capacity and dollars that go to those facilities. So they could potentially be spaces where programs for adult training could take place. So being a part of that dialogue about how do we re-envision what is possible in shelter, and what does it mean for a family when they go into shelter, and how can we work with the labor movement to make it so that a family who's in shelter leaves shelter and stays out of shelter. They're not going to become homeless again. So that would be a great conversation to be having, and particularly in areas where you're talking about Central Brooklyn, Northern Manhattan, South Bronx. All of those areas have a large number of shelters in them that could potentially be leveraged.
We've been saying we have to think about how we reimagine the shelter system, or reimagine how we address homelessness. I think we have to reimagine how labor unions can work in the 21st century. And I would actually love to hear from you in some other situation, how you and your colleagues are thinking about yourselves as an entity, how you work in the 21st century, because it must be different than the 20th century. I mean, in the 1980s, almost every contract job for construction was a union job, almost every job, and now it's less than half. So it's a political question. It's a very, very heavy weighted political question about how unions can be, and labor can be revitalized in the 21st century to respond to a totally different labor market, to a totally different world in which labor is conceptualized.
And I would just add, partnering with some of the career and technical education schools that Abbe spoke to earlier, I think that's really important. In my previous job, we were partnered with one, and they had a relationship with the Department of Transportation, but they didn't have a relationship with the labor union. So I think, again, how, without reinventing the wheel, where can folks fit in where the great work is already happening?
I think just to continue to say the same thing essentially, but really making sure as we're doing things like that, that we're matching it to the lives of the families while they're in shelter. So I think a lot of construction, transportation jobs operate at non-traditional hours, and so people are going to need childcare, and then policies for DHS and HRA shelters are going to have to change to match the fact that for some families their days are nights and their nights are days, and so a lot of times that just needs to be considered as well.
I was wondering what you see is the role of federal policy in alleviating homelessness here in New York, or do you feel like it needs to just be resolved locally?
Because I have, I'm very angry at Robert Moses, because he took away our imagination when it comes to what we can do in terms of building housing. There's so many amazing models out there around the world. You can look in places like Santiago, Chile, or just everywhere in the world. And and I put this question to Stephen Banks, and he gave a very real answer. He said, look, LaGuardia had a very good partner in making that happen. And it's true, I don't think city money can, if we do even have the will and the imagination to think about how we can build much more effective communities with public money and public housing, if we do have that will, we don't have the funds within the city. So we definitely need a federal partner in that regard.
I think also the Violence Against Women Act is something, BOFA funds is something that we've heard federally might be at risk, which funds both civil legal options and responses to domestic violence, which have an impact on housing and homelessness and victim safety, as well as a lot of the rate for DV shelters in New York State is federal pass-through money. And so if BOCA and VAWA are reduced in any sort of substantial way, it can have a huge impact on DV providers across the state and the country.
I would actually add that the community block grant, which is federally funded, is on the chopping block under this current political administration on a federal level. So to underscore absolutely, which I think goes back to civic engagement and making sure that folks are even aware what's really at risk and at stake with this proposed federal budget.
One of the things that we see and we feel is not being discussed, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is the amount of trauma that the families go through. And not just being a victim of domestic violence, but just the act of becoming homeless and what they have to go through and what the children go through. And we find that, for us, we try to treat the families in a multidisciplinary way to try to, because we see the trauma enacted physically as well as, mentally, and for the children and the moms not understanding how to deal with that with the kids. But we hardly hear that discussion as a whole for the trauma and how we deal with the trauma so we can reduce the recidivism of the families coming back into the shelter. I mean, we try, and we're seeing the majority of those families, but we're wondering why that discussion isn't, more in the public scope, to deal with. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
We recognize that trauma is huge, especially for our families. They're both experiencing the domestic violence, but often that's not the only trauma that they've experienced. There could be community or neighborhood violence. There often could be childhood abuse that's happened to them, and then just the fact of coming into the system and the grief and loss of leaving your neighborhood, leaving your home, leaving loved items behind. So I can talk about some of the things that Safe Horizon has done. We were one of the folks that won one of the Connections to Care grants through the mayor. And so what we're doing right now is we're training all of our staff in several different trauma-based modalities, both risk and connection, mental health first aid. And what we're doing for all of our services is looking at how sort of trauma impacts, not both our case management, but now how we deliver job training. We talked a little bit about that before, that we work with survivors on how are they going to respond to a supervisor who speaks harshly to them and triggers a flashback on how their abuser used to talk to them. right? How are survivors really working around financial resources and the shame that they might feel, or the fact that their abuser controlled all of their resources before. And so we're really adding this trauma lens into everything that we do, including really practical policies. So just to give you an example, one of the requirements from the state is that we have to do health and safety checks for our spaces to make sure that there's no child safety or fire hazards. And so years ago, that looked like walking around, knocking on a door, and usually it was one of our male maintenance workers yelling maintenance and going in. And what we realized that so many of our survivors are experiencing trauma that just triggered them immediately, and they went into that fight or flight mode. So then we started doing it at scheduled times, but we realized still that unexpected knock was really causing people to have a tremendous amount of anxiety and fear. And so now they know when we're coming, and we call upstairs to say, by the way, we're going to be there in about 2 minutes, so they know how to expect it. So it's not only has to impact your clinical programming, but also what the spaces look like, and people have places to lock their items. And so really, to be a truly trauma-informed space, it can't just impact sort of the clinical services that you're providing, but also has to impact the space and all of the other things.
I guess I'd just add that I think there is a larger conversation about trauma that's happening now, I feel like, than there has been in the past. But one element that I think is challenging is that there's not just one data point that's easy to quantify in terms of what is trauma. So I think as a group of people who are concerned about what is happening to families, what's happening to children, one thing that is really needed is to help people understand in these day-to-day experiences what might be traumatic triggers for people, particularly in school settings. So, one data point that I think we found helpful in terms of starting this conversation is just that in some neighborhoods, like in Highbridge Concourse in the Bronx, 1 out of every 4 kids in school in the last 5 years has been homeless. So if you're thinking about that as a teacher, if you're teaching in that area, how do you deal with separation for the children? What are you looking at in terms of, what kind of discipline strategies do you need? I mean, these are the conversations that we need to be having, but I think part of it is, first, how do we get out some of that information to help people understand the extent of trauma that families and children are experiencing? What did that trauma look like? What might those triggers look like? I think there is more information that's coming out now to show just how widespread that is, and that should help push that conversation forward. But it definitely is something that we need to be talking about more, and that we need to be giving concrete solutions, like Kelly was just talking about how do you actually navigate this in multiple different settings.
We don't look at the impact that race has on a lot of the clients. If you are Black and brown, you're gonna have a more difficult time getting employment, especially on a higher tier than someone who is not Black and brown. So that's gonna impact your ability to move into a higher financial economic strata than if you were not Black and brown. So, and also landlords in terms of that level of discrimination. And also communities, when people are trying to, even in shelters, a lot of times there's a lot of pushback from certain communities because the clients that are going to be in those shelters do not look like the people who are in the community. So this is something that I think, and I wonder why, I just want to pose that question, why it's never stated, even though the vast majority, if you look at the statistics, the vast majority of the clients are Black and brown, why that's not talked about. What are the implications to not discussing that? And what impact, is race having on the ability of these clients to move themselves out of the situation, or even why they ended up in the situation? I would like to talk more about that, because I just think it's just never discussed, and it's sort of, frustrating to see that. And also, last point is in terms of cultural competence. There's a lack of cultural competence, particularly at the highest level of the food chain in a lot of these places that service this population. And the people at the bottom who are serving, doing a direct service, of course they look like the clients, but they have very little power to enact change and change policy and change direction in terms of how agencies do their business. So can we address that a little bit?
I think even in the coalition that we're part of that's advocating for culturally relevant pedagogy within the school system across the entire city, it would be What needs to happen on the city service agency side is how do you also advocate for that as well? So that goes back to that creating a compassionate worker as well, because sometimes the workers become gatekeepers. And they very much can replicate systems of hierarchy and patriarchy and sexism and white supremacy, if we're being completely transparent about it. So everyone across the board, until it's valued by the top and you can create a training that humanizes the experience, and humanizing means recognizing the intersectionality of identity. You cannot negate someone's sexual orientation from their racial identity, from their gender when you're having these conversations. So I would advocate for, I don't have the power because we're a nonprofit, but I would advocate for, as much as we're fighting for schools to have culturally relevant and curriculum and training for teachers, how do we have that same kind of thing kind of roll out into city agencies?
I would just add that I think that there needs to be more of a conversation as well about, if you look at communities, individual communities, what you'll see is that in many cases across New York City, and this is something that's been talked about in newspapers, but that after the recession, basically there's this, or actually in 2008, there's a huge spike in unemployment and increase in low wage work. And then unemployment has started to go down overall across New York City. But if you look at the neighborhoods where it has not gone down, it is in the historically middle-class African-American neighborhoods. And if we're talking about the underpinnings of why we're seeing more Hispanic, Latino, and African-American families in shelter experiencing instability and homelessness and doubled up situations, those underlying economic issues need to be addressed. Because there's still, I can't remember the exact rate, but if you look in Williamsbridge and the Jamaica area, that the unemployment rates have not gone down in the same way that they have elsewhere. And they were starting out at around, I think, 8% and are still upwards of 10, 12%. So these are really structural economic issues that need to be addressed and are tied to communities and to demographics in those communities and to race and ethnicity. And I would just say that we see the same thing when we look at the education data. I was just flipping through one of the charts, and it's if you look at the proportion of students who are Black and Hispanic who are homeless, it's 66% of students in all of New York City public schools are Black or Hispanic, and that's 86% of students who are homeless. So these are things that we need to be talking about, and there are data points that are out there that could be used to be pushing forward that conversation in a more effective way.
I'll just add quickly first, thank you for raising that, because I think there is a real danger, I think, of trying to come up with, technocratic solutions to these problems, right? And building a better sort of service delivery system. We need that. But I think you're right, the real issues here, this is around equity and around social justice and racial justice. And frankly, there are very difficult conversations to be had about that. I think the other part, I think, of what needs to happen, though, is to hear from those folks directly. And a lot of times it's, people sort of talking about these people, and not always hearing directly from those folks and sort of really understanding what their perspective is. And really, bringing those perspectives to people who are making decisions. So we have a lot of work to do in that regard. I think there is real power in place-based approaches to this. And sort of, New York is really big. So if we can think about whether it's community district or zip code or school, whatever the geography is, I think there's lots to be figured out by having a community really come together and have these very honest conversations about what's really going on, and really speaking truth to power. So thank you again.
What do you think is like the Senate issue, or maybe one of the things that we should be focused on for employment, help people who are formerly incarcerated get a job?
I'm not an expert on this either. I will say that there are many folks that are very concerned about this. And unemployment is an issue that in the South Bronx we've seen it has many different facets to it, and this is the one you're naming is a really, really important one. I think there's lots that we have to do. There are very young people that are, coming out of incarceration that have, lots of educational needs that are unmet. And so, the CT conversations are part of that. The labor unions are part of that conversation. I don't think we have really figured out the best way to respond to this challenge. And so, what I would love is if we can. I know Bedside Restoration is really doing some good work, in this area. I'd love to have a conversation about what you guys have figured out and see how we can do more of that in the Bronx.
And I guess I'm just gonna make a plug for maybe how data could be helpful. But two things I would say. One is if we look further up the pipeline, I guess. If you look at the data that connects experiences of homelessness as a student, and then look at some of the data where you look at students who are enrolled in the East River Academy at Rikers or in Passages Academy, there is really, really high overlap. So what is happening early on? How can we help kids early on who are experiencing homelessness so they don't end up, because of these trauma experiences and because of how those sometimes might manifest, end up being shunted into the industrial prison complex. So that's one thing that I think is important to recognize, at least in terms of the intersection of these two issues. And then the other thing, I am not an expert on incarceration or employment, but what I would say, since you are a locally based organization, is that one thing that ICPH tries to do as an organization is to make as much data possible and available at that local level, so that can be used, and to that end, we have, in basically every publication we put out, we have lots of appendices, and I love appendices because it enables you to put the data at every single different geographic level, and that can be really useful for grant writing. So, when you do find the program that you want to be really driving towards, I hope that some of that information can be useful there.
How are you involving the churches with the homelessness situations, your local churches?
So we know the churches are helping the city with housing the street homeless. Kelly, anything other than that? Are you working with the churches?
Yeah, one way that we do is oftentimes in changing training church clergy around domestic violence, because oftentimes they're more likely to reach out to their faith leader or leaders in their church before coming, especially in communities of color. They're much more likely to go to a faith leader first to talk about it, and may be more comfortable receiving services there. So we will go and provide services to clergy or leadership to help them understand the dynamics of violence, to let them know what resources might be available to them, and sort of provide technical support. Because what we've really heard from many of the clergy members is that some of their parishioners are telling them that they're not interested in coming into a more formalized system, and they prefer to receive it at their church. And so we try to back them up with any resources or support that we can.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists and to all of you for joining us today. And special thanks to Morella and Ralph for speaking earlier. Thank you again. Have a great day.